I came home after nearly 2 decades away. No calls. No letters to announce it. Just the slow grind of tires over gravel as I pulled up to the house that used to be mine, the porch light flickering like it, too, was trying to forget I ever lived here. I'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times, picturing open arms or at least the soft relief of recognition. But all I got was a door that opened too slowly and the look of a man who'd just answered a knock from a stranger. My father. His eyes barely registered me before sliding past, like I was just another shadow in the dying light. His face was unreadable, stone-etched with the years I missed, the years he chose to never speak of me. No hug. No nod. No welcome home. My mother followed a moment later, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel as if I'd interrupted something inconvenient. She muttered something about how much my brother had changed and then, like a punch without force, tacked on a passing mention of his new bride. No eye contact. No real words for me. Just domestic updates, like I was an out-of-town guest, not their daughter. Not the girl who left with a duffel bag, a clearance badge, and a vow to serve something bigger than this broken family. I stood in the hallway, the scent of lemon polish and old furniture hitting me like a memory I hadn't agreed to remember. The framed pictures on the wall, all of them, were of him. My brother in high school. My brother in uniform. My brother shaking hands with someone in a suit. I scanned them slowly, realizing my face had been erased entirely. If I'd died, they might have mourned me more honestly. I asked about my room. My mother blinked and said they used it for storage now. The boxes are labeled if you need anything. That was it. No apology, no hesitation, just a casual redistribution of space, as if removing my presence was a matter of logistics. Later that night, I carried my bag down to the basement. The air was damp, thick with the smell of concrete and disuse. Pipes creaked above me like old bones. I sat on the edge of a narrow cot, my knees aching from the strain of stillness. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the basement window, barely wide enough to frame the moon. It was cold. Not just the kind of cold that gets into your skin, but the kind that settles in your chest and reminds you that no one thought to make the space warm for you. I wrapped my coat tighter, laid back, and stared at the ceiling like it might crack and bury me with the weight of everything unspoken. They didn't ask what I'd been doing all these years. Didn't mention my medals or deployments. Didn't ask where I'd been stationed or if I still had the nightmares. To them, I disappeared the moment I signed the papers and walked away from their narrative. I became a ghost they learned to live without. And yet I came back, hoping for something I didn't even have the words for. Redemption, maybe. Recognition. A small thread to tie myself back into this fabric I used to call family. But instead, I found a house that forgot me and people who never bothered to remember. That night, with my boots still on and my breath forming clouds in the dark, I finally understood. My years of elite service, the choices that haunted me, the blood on my hands, the ones I couldn't save, it all meant nothing here. My silence was more welcome than my story. So I lay still, listening to the house settle above me, like it was warning me not to stir the dust. And I whispered into the dark, not expecting anyone to hear. I came home, and no one noticed. They held the celebration in the backyard, white tents and polished folding chairs, champagne flutes tinkling like wind chimes every time someone toasted my brother. There were flags, printed programs, even a cake shaped like the insignia of his new rank. I stood near the edge of it all, just inside the shade of a low-hanging pine, watching the ritual play out like a scene rehearsed without me. No one asked how I'd been. No one even asked why I was there. I was introduced once, offhandedly, as Arden Michael's sister. She was in the military too, I think. Then they moved on, their smiles as polished and distant as their shoes. My presence barely disturbed the rhythm. Their gazes slid past me, their voices dropped whenever I got too close. Whispered scraps of stories. They didn't know the truth, of course. Just fragments. Rumors of some vague deployment. Words like discharged and disgraced were tossed around like confetti. I could feel the judgment clinging to my back like smoke. It was in the way the women narrowed their eyes when they spoke to me, all tight smiles and polite condescension. It was in the stiff handshake from the colonel who'd trained my brother and couldn't remember my name. It was in the laughter that always seemed to swell just after I passed. The speeches started. My father stood proud, chest puffed out in a way I hadn't seen since before I left. My brother soaked it in, wearing the polished grin of someone who had never been anything less than the golden sun. When he spoke, he thanked everyone: mentors, family, comrades. He didn't mention me. I stayed in the back, near the buffet table, where the shrimp cocktail was already beginning to sweat under the afternoon sun. I tried to distract myself, watching the way the breeze played with the edge of the tablecloth, how the ribbons on the centerpieces fluttered like they were trying to escape. But beneath it all was that old weight again. That ache behind the ribs. That knowledge that I didn't belong in the world I was born into. Then it happened. The murmur spread through the crowd before I saw him. A man in dress uniform, dark navy with ribbons that spanned his entire chest. The kind of presence that made people stand up straighter without realizing it. He walked through the crowd like a blade through water, everyone parting for him without a word. When he reached the center of the gathering, he didn't go to my brother. He turned, sharply, toward me, and saluted. "Commander Voss," he said, voice clear, carrying undeniable. For a second, no one breathed. I didn't. I couldn't. Time stilled, as if the entire party were a paused frame of film, and I was the only one not frozen. I hadn't heard that title spoken aloud in years. I'd buried it beneath top-secret files and classified missions, beneath therapy sessions where I was taught to separate who I was from what I'd done. Commander Voss didn't belong at backyard barbecues or family reunions. She belonged in night raids and radio silence. In deserts where the sun felt like judgment, and jungles that swallowed secrets whole. And yet there she was, revealed. The officer didn't waver. His eyes held mine, sharp and full of knowing. Recognition passed between us, not of faces, but of truth. Of shared darkness. Of the weight we both carried in silence. The crowd shifted. I felt it. Heads turned. Eyebrows lifted. The whispers changed tune, half fearful, half awed. Someone asked, "Commander?" like the word itself was foreign on their tongue. Others stared as if I had just stepped out of a myth they weren't sure was real. My brother's expression faltered, just for a second. Enough for me to see it, confusion laced with something else. Uncertainty, maybe. Resentment. Maybe even the smallest spark of shame. My father's hand dropped from my brother's shoulder. My mother looked down at her plate. I stood still. Didn't smile. Didn't move. Didn't explain. I let the silence grow. Let it stretch out over them like a net. Let them feel, for one single breath, what it meant to be in the presence of a truth they had chosen to ignore. They didn't know that I had led a covert strike unit that didn't officially exist. That we operated in shadows, so deep they erased our names. That our missions were so sensitive, not even the president got briefed on the details. That I had made decisions no human should ever have to make, and lived with them. They didn't know. And suddenly it mattered. For years, I had been invisible to them. A blank space where a daughter used to be. But now they had to look. Now they had to see. The salute made it impossible not to. I gave the officer a nod. Just a small one. But inside, something shifted. Not peace. Not yet. But a reclaiming. I was no longer just the girl who slept in the basement. I was Commander Voss. And they would remember it. It happened late. Past midnight. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood contracting in the night air. I was alone in the basement, sitting on the edge of the cot, absently thumbing through a dossier I hadn't opened in years. Just muscle memory, something to keep my hands occupied while my thoughts raced nowhere. Then, my secure device buzzed. Not a message. Not a ping. A red alert. Level 7 containment violation. Polaris Archive. My stomach dropped before my mind could catch up. The Polaris Archive was not some public-facing military record. It was a black cell repository, buried in the kind of clearance that doesn't show up in any credential. Fewer than 20 people on Earth were ever authorized to even know it existed. I was one of them. Had been since the day I took command. I keyed in my biometric sequence, 3 layers deep, and the data unfolded across the screen like a funeral shroud. Unauthorized access. IP trace. Internal. Same network. Same house. I froze. It took me 3 rapid commands to locate the source. The trail was sloppily hidden, a civilian-level attempt at stealth. The endpoint resolved to a guest device connected through the home's Wi-Fi. And the name on the device? Evelyn Marie Voss. My brother's wife. I sat there, the glow of the screen painting everything in the room a sickly blue. Evelyn, who smiled too politely, who laughed just a little too hard when I was around. Evelyn, the fresh-faced military history grad who wore her thesis like a badge. Evelyn, who had made a point of asking if I ever missed the excitement. The air felt thinner. My pulse beat in my ears. I pushed off the cot and climbed the basement stairs like I was ascending from a grave. The hallway upstairs smelled faintly of lavender and burnt toast. I followed the faint trail of light seeping from under the study door. I didn't knock. I opened it. She was there, hunched over a borrowed laptop, her face bathed in light, fingers dancing nervously over a trackpad. When she saw me, she startled, too fast to be innocent. "Arden," she stammered, hand instinctively moving to close the screen. "Don't," I said. One word. Flat. Final. She froze. I walked in slowly, the weight of every consequence pressing down on my spine. "What did you access?" Evelyn swallowed hard. It was nothing classified. I swear. I was researching for a paper. A case study. I didn't mean to trigger anything. My jaw clenched. "You breached Polaris." She blinked. "I didn't know that's what it was. I found an old citation, some buried operation reference. I thought it was just a ghost file. I didn't even realize I was in a secure network. It was just a rabbit hole." I could feel heat rising in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. More surgical. A rabbit hole. That's what she called it. The operation that broke 4 of my team. The mission that never ended because we weren't allowed to speak of it. A rabbit hole that swallowed the best parts of us. "You set off a containment cascade," I said quietly. "Every black site with Polaris flags is now on active lockdown. Anyone still alive is being tracked, flagged, interrogated. Do you know what that means?" I didn't. "You didn't think," I snapped, my voice slicing through the room. Her face paled. "You thought you were being clever, playing war games with digital tombstones. You have no idea what you touched." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes shimmered with confused tears. Tears I didn't trust. Tears I'd seen in interrogations, in hearings, in war rooms where officers played dumb as they signed away people's lives. This wasn't just a mistake. It was exposure. Of people. Of places. Of truths the world wasn't supposed to know. I could see it now, the old gears grinding back to life. The silent satellites repositioning. The dormant clearance pings lighting up again. It was all happening. A slow, systemic collapse of everything we'd buried in the dark to keep the world safe from what we had done. And it started here. With her. I stood there, barely breathing, as Evelyn muttered again that she was sorry. That she didn't understand. That she didn't mean harm. But harm doesn't need intention. Just access. Just one wrong keystroke, and everything you bled to protect gets pulled into the light. I looked at her one last time, really looked. She wasn't evil. She wasn't malicious. But she was careless. And, in our world, that's enough to get people killed. So, I turned away. Quietly. Coldly. Down the hall, my secure device buzzed again. Incoming directives, escalation notices, containment instructions. It had begun. And no matter how deep we tried to bury it, the past was no longer silent. I hadn't heard Senator Buckley's voice in years. But the moment it hit the airwaves, sharp and full of contempt, I recognized it instantly. A voice like a knife, slow, deliberate, designed to carve truth into a shape that served him. I was sitting in the dark again, this time not in a basement, but in the front seat of my parked rental outside a secure storage unit 2 states over. Rain tapped on the windshield like a Morse code warning. He was speaking at a press conference. A podium, flags, an American seal behind him. He leaned into the microphone with theatrical gravity and said the word, Polaris, out loud. My body went rigid. He wasn't supposed to know that name. Not him. Not anyone without 5 layers of code word clearance. But there it was, spilling from his mouth with the ease of someone who had no idea how many bodies that word was built on. He painted it as a scandal, a covert experiment in female-led elite warfare gone rogue. An embarrassment. A liability. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. This wasn't just a leak. This was a political hit job. And we were the target. Behind the podium, Buckley smirked that polished smile of a man who's never had blood under his nails. He spoke of accountability, of transparency, of protecting traditional structures of command. But what he really meant was dismantling what we built. Erasing the unit I gave my soul to. We were never his ideal soldiers. Too unconventional, too female, too effective. And now, because of Evelyn's mistake, he had a weapon. He was already pushing for hearings. Demanding audits. Targeting individuals by code name. I could see where it was heading, Names dragged into the open, mission records weaponized, people sacrificed not for justice, but for optics. Evelyn had been summoned for review that morning. They came with two men in gray suits and polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They didn't cuff her, didn't raise their voices. They didn't have to. That kind of control doesn't need volume. It needs certainty, the kind that says, "You've already lost.
You just don't know it yet."
When she returned, she looked like she'd aged 10 years. Her eyes were swollen, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't cry. Not this time. Just sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor. "They knew things I didn't even know I looked at," she said quietly. "They asked questions like they already had the answers. About you. About the operation." I watched her for a long moment. No judgment. Just assessment. Somewhere in the chaos, her fear had calcified into something else. Not guilt. Not yet. But awareness. She looked up at me, and for the first time since the breach, she said what I never expected to hear. "I want to fix it. Tell me what to do." I didn't speak for a long time. Just stood. Walked to the closet. Pulled down the fireproof case I had hidden behind years of civilian camouflage. Winter coats, dusty photo albums, meaningless storage. Inside were 3 encrypted drives and a stack of DV tapes, labeled only by code. I hadn't touched them in over a decade, but I remembered each label like a scar. Raven 7, Night Run. Polaris 4, TAC recording. Zulu Orchid, debrief unsanctioned. I carried them like fragile bones and set them down on the dining table between us. "These are the records," I said. "Unredacted. Full spectrum. No filters, no edits. The truth they'll never want in the official transcript." Evelyn stared at them, and for a second, her fingers hovered over one tape like she was touching a relic from a war she'd never fought in. "This is what they'll use against you?" I shook my head slowly. "This is what we'll use for us. We're not hiding anymore." I booted up my secure terminal. She sat beside me in silence, watching as I decrypted the first mission log. The room was dim, lit only by the screen's glow and the occasional flash of lightning outside. Rain beat harder on the windows, like the storm had decided to bear witness. As footage flickered onto the screen, night vision, voices, gunfire, breathless commands, I glanced at Evelyn. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. She watched as the mythology of war gave way to its raw, human truth. That night, in that little house full of ghosts and tension, we began building the only thing that might save us, a defense rooted in the truth. Not the one politicians would parade, not the story shaped for headlines, but the real one, the one we paid for in sweat, silence, and the lives of those we buried with no names on their graves. Buckley had started a war. He just didn't realize yet. I had never stopped fighting. The hallway outside the hearing room was long, sterile, and silent in a way that made your own footsteps feel incriminating. I walked it slowly, my boots striking the polished floor with measured force, like I needed to prove, with each step, that I still existed, that I still had a right to be heard. 2 armed guards stood at the end of the corridor. Not ceremonial, not there for show. Real security for a real threat.
Me.
The double doors opened with a mechanical hiss, revealing the private chamber they called a military review room. No windows. No cameras, at least not the kind you could see. A long wooden table anchored the center, surrounded by 7 officials in dress uniform and civilian suits. The lighting was cold, surgical, humming faintly overhead like the buzz of insects waiting to feed. At the far end of the table sat Colonel Trent. Our eyes locked the moment I stepped in. He didn't blink. He didn't smirk. He simply observed me with that reptilian detachment I remembered too well, the same look he gave the first time he called my leadership experimentally misguided. The man had spent years undermining my work, manipulating records, and cherry-picking fragments of missions to paint me as unstable, insubordinate, dangerous. This was his arena. But not today. Today I had something he didn't expect, evidence. I took my seat, back straight, shoulders squared. I folded my hands and rested them on the table, steady.
Calm.
But under the surface, my pulse thudded like a warning drum. The committee chair cleared her throat. "Commander Voss, you've been summoned to provide testimony regarding Operation Polaris and your role in its execution, termination, and subsequent silence. Do you understand the scope of this inquiry?" "I do," I said, voice steady. "And I intend to speak plainly." There was a moment of uncomfortable shifting in the room. Papers rustled. Pens tapped. Then Trent leaned forward, hands folded in mock civility. Before we begin, I want to remind the witness that this is a secure setting. Anything you share here remains under classified review until formally declassified. Misrepresenting the facts will result in revocation of all honors and criminal indictment under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The words were rehearsed, a threat dressed as a procedure. I looked directly at him. Then let's make sure we start with the actual facts. I reached into my satchel and slid a small encrypted drive across the table. Evelyn Voss, my brother's wife, retrieved this from the Polaris digital vault. It contains decrypted logs, mission feeds, and metadata overlays that contradict the official narrative. Trent didn't touch it. He glanced to one of his aides, who nodded and took the drive. I continued. These logs show falsified timestamps, fabricated casualty reports, and omitted field orders. The data contradicts what Colonel Trent submitted in his classified evaluation, specifically, the claim that the operation failed due to command breakdown under my leadership. Trent shifted, just slightly. Not enough for most to notice. But I saw it. A flinch behind the armor. Commander Voss, one of the civilians asked, "Can you speak plainly? Was the mission a failure?" I met his eyes.
No.
It wasn't. My voice filled the room now, not raised, but resonant. The mission succeeded. We neutralized the target, secured all high-value intelligence, and extracted all primary personnel with minimal civilian impact. But when we returned, we were ordered to disband.
No debrief. No commendation.
No official record. The narrative was crafted, manufactured, to erase the operation and its implications. A beat of silence. Then Evelyn stood from the back of the room, where she had been allowed to observe. She walked forward, palms slightly trembling but eyes clear, and placed printed reports in front of each panel member. "These are side-by-side comparisons," she said. "The original logs and the altered ones. Cross-referenced with timestamps, satellite pings, and communications. It proves systematic tampering." I watched as their eyes scanned the pages, expressions shifting, confusion giving way to realization. Some blinked rapidly, others sat motionless, jawlines tense. And then the chair looked up. "Colonel Trent, can you explain this discrepancy?" He didn't answer right away. His face was pale now, tight. His lips pursed as though trying to form a defense, but finding none. He reached for a water glass with a shaking hand. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. I leaned forward, voice low, cutting. We were erased because we didn't fit the doctrine. A female-led team operating outside traditional structure, succeeding where others failed. That was never going to be a narrative the old guard supported. So they buried us.
Lit.
You buried us. Trent looked at me now. Not with arrogance, but something closer to fear. One of the committee members leaned to the chair and whispered something. A motion was made. A vote was called. A decision, sealed for review, was passed without a word from Trent. I stood.
No chairs.
No victory music. Just the stillness of truth reclaiming space it was denied. Outside the chamber, Evelyn met me in the hallway. Her eyes were red, but dry. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The weight was still there. The cost of what had been lost. But for the first time in years, something else sat beside it. Justice. Not in full. Not yet. But finally, it had a name.
Me.
They gave me the order in a black envelope. Plain, unmarked. The weight of it heavier than paper had any right to be. Inside, Directive Emberlight. Reinstatement of Field Command. Immediate mobilization. High-priority neutralization of an emergent paramilitary faction destabilizing multiple regions along the northern corridor. I stood alone in the hangar when I read it. The roar of idle engines echoed off metal walls. The smell of jet fuel and steel hung thick in the air, the same way it had back then. The same way it always did before something unforgivable. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb. I should have felt vindicated. After everything, after the hearing, the buried truths, the betrayal, and the unburial of ghosts, they were handing me command again, trusting me to lead. Or maybe just using me to clean up the mess no one else would touch. They named it Emberlight. Pretty name for a kill order. The threat was real. A paramilitary force growing faster than satellite data could track. Well-organized, well-funded, and dangerously invisible on the official grid.
No uniforms.
No clear flags. Just purpose, and the means to fulfill it. Our analysts were calling them a hybrid threat, Ideology meets mercenary structure. And they were spreading. But command didn't give me full control. They gave me Danner. Lieutenant Colt Danner. A rising star in all the worst ways. Medals polished too bright. Speeches memorized. A soldier carved from doctrine, fresh out of war college, and high on procedure. They said he'd be my liaison. A chain of command anchor. But really, he was their leash. The first time we met, he didn't salute. "You're Commander Voss," he said flatly, looking me over like I was a suspicious piece of intel. "I've read your file." "Then you should know saluting would be redundant," I said, folding the envelope into my pocket. His jaw flexed. And I could already see it in his posture. The doubt, the quiet defiance. He didn't trust me. Probably didn't believe half the stories. And the half he did believe, he didn't respect. "I'll be observing the unit," he said, "making sure protocol is maintained. Clean up, clear chain of command." "You're welcome to observe," I replied, meeting his gaze with the kind of stillness that once held interrogation rooms hostage. "But I lead this team. Not the files. Not the chatter. Me." The days that followed were tight with tension. We built the team fast, carefully but fast. A mix of seasoned operators and green recruits. Some had heard of Polaris. One even saluted me with a hesitant smile. Most just watched, waiting to decide whether I was still a leader or a relic. Every decision was a calculation. Every meeting layered in subtext. Logistics came late. Supply chains got delayed. Intel packets were conveniently incomplete. At first I thought it was incompetence. It wasn't. It was sabotage. Quiet, deniable, political sabotage. They didn't want me to fail outright. They just wanted to slow me down. Keep me buried under bureaucracy until the op collapsed on its own. Then they could say they tried. But I'd been underestimated before. I wasn't going to let it happen again. I worked around them, pulled favors from old ghosts. I had just enough shadow left in the system to reroute resources under alternate tags. Unofficial. Untraceable. I built the operation from inside their walls, using their own neglect as fuel. I didn't wait for permission. I gave it to myself. Danner pushed back. "This isn't how operations are supposed to run," he said one night, standing in the command tent as the storm rolled over the mountains beyond. "This isn't how threats are supposed to evolve," I shot back. "We don't have time to beg the brass for updates. Every delay gives them more ground." He looked at me, stormlight flashing in his eyes. "You're breaking procedure." "No," I said quietly, stepping closer, voice low and exact. "I'm breaking their grip. And if you're not here to fight, Lieutenant, you're in the wrong damn tent." He didn't answer. But he didn't leave either. By the time we deployed, the op was mine. My plan. My team. My name on the line. And when the rotor blades kicked up dust and we rose into the sky under the black cover of 0400 hours, I looked out over the dark ridgeline and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Command. Not power. Not glory. Just clarity. Purpose forged in the fire of everything they tried to erase. Whatever waited for us in the shadows of Emberlight, it wouldn't break me. Because they gave me the directive. But I chose the mission. Nothing ever goes exactly as planned. That's something you learn early. First in simulations, then in the field, and finally in the silence between missions when you're left counting the names of those who didn't come back. Still, I'd allowed myself the smallest illusion of control as we entered the outer perimeter of Emberlight. The terrain scans were clean. The recon drones gave us 3 clear entry points. Our comms pinged green. Then everything fell apart. We were barely inside the second sector when the first explosion hit. A pressure-triggered trap, low yield, high noise. Enough to wound, not to kill. Enough to scatter us. The kind of trap that wasn't in the terrain report because the terrain report had been doctored. That realization landed heavier than the blast itself. Dirt sprayed up in a wide arc, and the world twisted sideways. For a split second, the dust in the air caught the light like ash from some old fire I thought I'd buried. I hit the ground, rolled behind a half-buried ridge beam, and scanned the chaos through the scope on my rifle. Friendly markers blinked erratically. Screams.
Static.
Comms bursting and fading like dying breaths. I cursed, throat raw with grit, and keyed into the squad channel. "All units, pull back to fallback position Delta. Regroup now. Go dark." No chatter unless confirmed visual. No response. Someone screamed close. Too close. I pushed up, knees grinding against broken stone, and sprinted toward the sound. Martinez was down. leg caught under twisted rebar, blood pumping too fast. She was trying not to scream, teeth clenched so tight I thought she'd crack bone. She still had her sidearm raised, still covering the flank. God, she was good. "I've got you," I muttered, crouching down. "Don't you dare pass out on me." "I'm fine," she hissed, lying through her teeth. "Just a scratch." It wasn't. I dragged her out with one arm and fired with the other, suppressing movement from behind a collapsed watchtower. The enemy was well positioned. Too well. Whoever we were fighting, they weren't improvising. This was planned. They were waiting. They knew us. I got Martinez to cover, shoved a field clamp on her wound, and moved again. One by one, I pulled them out. Ramos, bleeding from the shoulder. Lee, concussed and disoriented. 2 others separated, but still fighting. I moved like a ghost through that battlefield, using terrain that wasn't on the maps, corridors that didn't exist in our data. And I knew why. Because I'd seen this before. Years ago, in a mission no one was ever supposed to talk about, we encountered an enemy that didn't just anticipate our moves, they mirrored them. They rewrote our terrain mid-up, faked entire landscapes, then watched as we walked into illusions designed to maim, not kill. We called it the Mirage Trap. Classified. Disavowed. And now it was happening again. Same pattern. Same misdirection. And the same damn detonation system. I found it buried beneath an old transmission tower, connected to a series of seismic nodes. A network of charges, designed to bring the whole structure down if we advanced another meter. One touch to the wrong panel, and we'd collapse into a burial ground of our own making. But I'd seen this wiring before. I disarmed it once, with a broken wrist and blood in my eyes. And even now, all these years later, my hands remembered what the mind tried to forget. I dropped to the floor, ignoring the fire in my knees, and opened the panel. Color-coded wires. Falsely looped triggers. Dual-frequency receivers. My fingers moved fast, quicker than thought, instinct taking over. Cut the green, split the blue. Wait for the flash, not the sound. Detach the decoy fuse. Sequence left, not right. One final wire. One breath.
Snip.
Silence. Then, a soft exhale behind me. I turned. Danner. His weapon was lowered. His face was pale but steady. Dirt smeared across his cheek like war paint. He had followed me through the chaos, disobeying every instruction about chain of command and proper distance. He had seen me carry the wounded, drag us back from a trap designed to end us. And now he saw this. The system. The disarmed bomb. The truth of what we were up against. For a long moment, we just stood there in the half-light of a dying structure. Rain had started to fall again, soft, almost merciful. Then, he did something I hadn't expected. He stepped forward, straightened his back, and saluted. No hesitation. No irony. No half-hearted gesture of forced respect. A real salute. I looked at him, at the dirt-caked lines on his face, the glint of understanding finally settling behind his eyes. And I nodded once, just enough for him to know I accepted it. Not because I needed validation, but because sometimes acknowledgement matters. Sometimes, after all the noise and blood and silence, you just want someone to say, "I see you." We regrouped under the collapsed overhang. I checked each team member. 1 dead, 3 wounded, all accounted for. Emberlight was compromised. But we weren't. Not anymore. We weren't ghosts this time. We weren't expendable. We were still standing. And they were going to feel every step we took from here on out. It wasn't the first time I'd walked into that room. But this time it was different. This time, they stood when I entered. The corridor felt shorter than before, though I knew every inch of it by heart. Same cold floors. Same sterile lights. But now there was weight behind my footsteps. Not the weight of secrets, not the burden of silence, but the slow, undeniable presence of truth finally demanding to be heard. Evelyn walked beside me. Her face was calm, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. The deliberate way she held her shoulders, like she was bracing for impact even as she moved toward it willingly. We hadn't spoken much that morning. We didn't need to. Some things were beyond words. The chamber was packed this time. Word had gotten out. What started as a closed-door inquiry was now a high-stakes reckoning. A full panel. Observers from defense, intelligence, even 2 senators seated behind privacy glass. And at the center of it all, Colonel Trent, sitting with his hands folded tightly, lips a thin, bloodless line. He didn't meet my gaze when I walked in. He didn't have to. He already knew. I took my seat at the front table, the terminal waiting before me like a podium in a war room. Evelyn stood just behind me, a tablet in her hands, the decryption files loaded and ready. Hundreds of pages of metadata, mission logs, timestamps, audio overlays, and embedded command signatures. Every falsified report, every manipulated data trail, every redacted outcome that had twisted our history into something convenient. The committee chair, a woman who had previously avoided even saying my name, cleared her throat. Commander Voss, the floor is yours. I took a slow breath.
And began.
We were never ghosts, I said. We were never the failures they made us out to be. Polaris wasn't an error. It was a success. So successful, it scared the men who couldn't control it. I tapped the terminal, and the screen behind me came to life. Lines of code, mission diagrams, voice logs. The voice of a soldier, my voice, calling out coordinates in the middle of a firefight. The voices of my team, executing with precision, with courage. Not the chaos Colonel Trent described in his now-debunked report. Not the collapse of leadership he'd fabricated to cover his political betrayal. Evelyn stepped forward next. Her voice was clear, strong, but without arrogance. She walked them through the data comparisons, highlighting the anomalies. Showed them how entire after-action reports had been rewritten post-submission. How key failures were inserted where none existed. How timelines were shifted to imply insubordination where there had only been classified improvisation under duress. The room was silent as she spoke. No paper rustling.
No coughing.
Just silence, thick and sharp, like everyone knew they were standing in the presence of a truth too long ignored. When she finished, I stood again. The intent, I said, turning to face the panel, was never to preserve national security. It was to preserve reputations. To silence those who succeeded outside their rules. To erase a history that didn't fit the mold. I turned and looked directly at Trent. You used my name as a warning. You turned it into a whisper, a cautionary tale for others who might step outside your lines. But I am done being your footnote. There was no outburst.
No scouting.
Just stillness. Then the chair spoke. Carefully. Formally. In light of new evidence and confirmed data manipulation, Colonel Trent is hereby relieved of command, pending full military tribunal. All findings from the Polaris investigation are to be reviewed under independent oversight. A pause. Then, Commander Arden Voss, your record is hereby restored. Your commendations reinstated. And your leadership acknowledged. It should have felt like victory. But what I felt in that moment was stillness. Not relief. Not joy. Just the quiet unfolding of a truth finally standing on its own legs. Afterward, people stood. Not just for formality, but because they chose to. Hands reached out. Faces that had once looked past me now met my gaze, with something closer to respect. I saw it in the tight nod from the intel director. The whispered thank you from a young female officer near the back. Even Danner was there, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the moment that stopped me was when the chair leaned in once more and said softly, "Thank you, Commander Voss."
Voss.
Not a code name, not a clearance level, not a scandal.
A name.
My name. I left the chamber that day not as someone seeking to be remembered, but as someone who had reclaimed the right never to be forgotten. I didn't expect anything to change. Not really. Not at home. I had walked out of that hearing room with history rewritten and my name restored, but some battles don't end in public chambers. Some don't end at all. They echo. In the quiet glances across a dinner table. In the walls of a house that remember the words never said. In the spaces where love was withheld so long, you stopped looking for it. But I returned anyway. The cab pulled up to the curb like it had 20 years ago, on the day I first left, eager, defiant, terrified, and full of silent hope. The yard looked the same. Overgrown at the edges, weeds creeping along the fence line. The porch light flickered like always, a bulb half-tight in its socket. A tired wind chime clinked lazily in the breeze. I stood there longer than I meant to, bag slung over my shoulder, boots still dusted with red clay from the base. My hands trembled, just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything unsaid between these walls. For a long time, I thought silence was a kind of mercy. Now I knew it for what it really was, a wound that never heals, only hides. The door opened before I could knock. My father stood there. No grand gesture. No outstretched arms. Just a man older than I remembered, his eyes shadowed with something he hadn't let me see before. Regret. He stepped back to let me in. Wordless. I walked past him, into the same hallway where, years ago, he'd once said nothing at all when I told him I was leaving for officer training. I remembered how he'd stared at the wall then, as if I were just a noise passing through. But this time he turned. "You look tired," he said softly, voice worn and low. I nodded. "I've earned it." A pause. Then almost too quiet to catch. I watched the hearing. All of it. My breath caught. I hadn't even known he owned a computer that worked. "I didn't know," he continued. "I didn't let myself know. That was easier." He looked at me, really looked. "You did something they didn't have the courage to face. You protected people. Paid for it. Survived it." He swallowed hard. "That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's courage." The words sat heavy in the room, like it didn't quite belong but needed to be said anyway. My father's face didn't soften. He was still a hard man, carved from discipline and silence, but his eyes shifted. There was something there now. Recognition. "I'm sorry," he added. I nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the road to it. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in. She turned when she heard my steps, hands still damp from the dishwater, a towel crumpled between her fingers like she needed something to grip to stay upright. "I was wrong," she said before I could even open my mouth. "All those years, I thought staying quiet was safer. I thought if we didn't speak of it, we couldn't lose you." She stepped closer, tentative. "But silence doesn't protect. It only isolates." She reached out and took my hand, hers warm, mine still cold from the outside world. "I should have told you I was proud," she said, voice trembling. "I should have told you every time I thought it." I didn't pull away. That night, they took out the old photo albums, the ones I'd never been in, the ones that made it feel like I had only existed in the negative space between smiles. But this time, my mother opened a new frame. A photo, printed from the official archives, newly released, me in uniform. Stern.
Strong.
A snapshot from my Polaris deployment, taken just before a mission that never officially happened. She placed it between my brother's graduation photo and their wedding portrait.
No fanfare. No ceremony.
Just a quiet admission. You belong here. I watched the light catch on the frame as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. Later, I stepped outside, needing air. The cicadas hummed in the trees. The scent of cut grass lingered in the breeze. And then I heard it. Footsteps on the pavement.
Small. Fast.
A girl, maybe 9 or 10, stood at the edge of the lawn, half hiding behind a bicycle. Helmet askew, eyes wide with nervous wonder. "You're Commander Voss, right?" she asked, voice high but sure. I blinked, surprised. "I suppose I am." She bit her lip, then smiled. "I want to be strong like you." The word struck me harder than any metal ever had. I knelt, met her eyes. "Then start with this," I said gently. "Never mistake silence for peace. And never let anyone tell you strength is just about winning." She nodded, not quite understanding, but knowing enough to tuck it away for later. As she rode off, I stood there on the lawn, listening to the sound of rubber tires bumping down the sidewalk, and something opened in my chest. For the first time in years, I smiled, not because the world had changed, but because I had. Because strength wasn't about glory. It was about truth. About surviving the silence and learning how to speak again. And I finally had. They knew my name now. And so did the future. The folding chairs were mismatched. Some creaked when you shifted your weight. Others leaned slightly to the left. The air inside the community hall smelled faintly of varnish and old books. The kind of place where people gathered not because of spectacle, but because of something quieter, something real. There were maybe 100 of them. Veterans with calloused hands and cautious eyes. Women who wore their scars beneath pressed blouses. Survivors of systems of silence, of the long and grinding kind of injustice that doesn't make headlines, but leaves you altered all the same. There were teenagers in the back row, fidgeting, pretending not to care. A mother holding a child against her chest. A young man in a wheelchair who stared at me like he already knew the ending to my story. I stood at the podium, heart steady, palms open against the wood.
No uniform. No insignia.
Just me, Arden Voss. And this time, they wanted to hear. I took a breath. When I left home at 19, I didn't leave as a warrior. I left because I didn't know how to stay invisible any longer. I wasn't born into recognition. I had to carve it, sometimes through shadow, sometimes through blood. The room held still. Not silent with disinterest, but with attention. You could feel it, the way people leaned forward slightly, the way they exhaled in sync, as if hearing someone name the thing they thought only lived in their own chest. They told me leadership was a privilege reserved for the ones who fit the mold. I didn't. So they erased me. I paused. My hands gripped the edge of the lectern. But I came back anyway. A hum of low emotion rippled through the hall. Someone wiped their eyes in the second row. I stood trial for the truth. Not in a court, but in front of people who wrote me off before they even knew my name. I was labeled reckless, insubordinate, unstable because I led with something they didn't understand. Instinct.
Grit.
Empathy. I made decisions they weren't brave enough to face. And when we succeeded, they called it a problem. I scanned the room. Every eye locked on mine now. Not with pity, with recognition. But here's what I've learned. You don't need their permission to matter. You don't need their approval to speak. What you need, what we all need, is the courage to be seen, even if it's just once. Even if it's just for each other. I reached into my coat and pulled out a piece of wire. Thin, coiled, nothing remarkable to the outside eye. The same kind of wire I used to detonate charges. The same kind that had once been the difference between life and death in the field. I held it up, watched the light catch it. This isn't a weapon anymore, I said. It's a reminder of what we carried, of what we lost, of what we still endure. And then I told them, don't let silence write your story. Don't hand your narrative to people who never fought beside you. Speak, even if your voice trembles. Reclaim space, even if you have to start with just 1 square foot of it. History doesn't belong only to the ones with power. It belongs to those who survive it. They stood when I finished. Not in applause. In solidarity. That night, I stayed long after the last person left. I packed my notes slowly, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought of my team. The ones who made it. The ones who didn't. I thought of that last mission, the sound of rotor blades, the coded comms, the moment when silence meant survival. And how now, for the first time, I could finally speak without fear. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the parking lot like paper stories too long unread. And I walked into it with my head high, because I was seen. At last. There are things you carry that never leave your body. The echo of commands shouted in the dark. The texture of earth beneath your knees as you dig through wreckage. The dry click of a rifle just before a breathless second of decision. The names. God, the names. But some things you carry because they are proof. The detonator wire sits coiled in the small side pocket of my pack. No longer wired to explosives. No longer a tool for ending things. Now, it's a tether to memory. To the team that called me commander without irony. To the unit that wasn't supposed to exist. To a legacy built in shadow. Not for glory, but for purpose. They tried to erase Polaris. Tried to scrub us from history with silence, with shame, with a sharp edge of institutional fear. But they failed. Because now the truth is out. We endure in documents once redacted, now released. In testimonies sworn in public record. In the ripple of lives changed by the courage to speak. We exist in the spaces once denied to us. In textbooks, in quiet conversations, in young recruits who say, I heard about her. We're no longer ghosts. I am Arden Voss, strike commander, survivor of silence, witness of the truth, builder of what they try to bury. Polaris was never a mistake. It was a message the world wasn't ready for, until now. And as I walk forward, into whatever comes next, I carry the proof. Because some names aren't whispered in history. They carry it.